It begins quietly, almost imperceptibly. One day, you wake up and realize that the life you've been living doesn't entirely feel like your own. The words you speak, the clothes you wear, even the opinions you hold. Somehow, they all seem rehearsed, borrowed from a script written long before you arrived. You start noticing how people move through the world with a kind of practiced rhythm, saying the right things, laughing at the right jokes, agreeing even when they disagree. And you wonder when you signed up for this unspoken performance. The first act of rebellion isn't loud. It's a small thought you don't dismiss, a quiet refusal to pretend. It's deciding not to nod when everyone else is nodding. It's saying, I don't know, when certainty is expected. That's when you feel the air shift around you. People notice, not with confrontation, but with silence. They start looking at you differently, as though you've broken an invisible rule no one dared to mention aloud. At first, you think it's freedom. You breathe easier, thinking you've escaped something suffocating. But soon you realize freedom carries a strange kind of loneliness. The conversations you used to blend into now feel shallow. You try to share what you're seeing, but the words come out wrong, like foreign currency no one can exchange. You stop trying after a while. You learn to keep certain thoughts to yourself. There's a comfort in pretending, and when you stop, you realize how much of the world depends on that shared illusion. People want you to be predictable, agreeable, familiar. When you step outside that pattern, it unsettles them. They retreat politely, but firmly. You notice the invitations slow down, the smiles fade quicker, the warmth replaced by a thin layer of distance. It's not cruelty, it's discomfort. You become a mirror they don't want to look into. Silence becomes your language. You start watching more than speaking, listening more than responding. In that quiet, you begin to see how fragile normality is. Everyone is playing a part because the alternative, being seen as different, is unbearable. You understand now why most people stay inside the script. Belonging, even at the cost of authenticity, feels safer than solitude. The punishment for honesty isn't always rejection. Sometimes it's misunderstanding. People misinterpret your calm as arrogance, your detachment as judgment, your silence as indifference. They can't see that behind it all, there's just exhaustion, tiredness from bending your spirit into shapes that fit someone else's mold. You stop explaining yourself, because every explanation feels like a betrayal of something sacred. There are nights when you question if you've made a mistake. Maybe you should have stayed where it was warm, familiar, uncomplicated. Maybe being different isn't noble. It's just isolating. You scroll through the noise of the world and see how everyone seems connected, busy, validated. Yet the more you look, the more artificial it feels. You sense a quiet sadness beneath their performances, the same one you once carried without noticing. It's strange comfort, realizing that conformity doesn't protect people from emptiness. It only hides it. You begin to notice small things others overlook. The tremor in someone's laughter, the hesitation before a confident statement, the tiredness behind perfect smiles. You realize most people aren't shallow, they're just afraid. Afraid to stop playing the role that keeps them accepted. You stop resenting them. You understand that everyone's rebellion looks different and not everyone is ready for theirs. There's peace in that understanding, but also melancholy. You miss the simplicity of not thinking too deeply, of belonging without conflict. But once you've seen the edges of the illusion, you can't unsee them. The world feels both wider and emptier. Freedom has space, but space can echo. And in those echoes, you sometimes hear your own doubts coming back to you, asking if the cost was worth it. Still, there's something sacred in choosing truth over comfort. It teaches you patience, the kind that comes from walking alone through a crowd. You start valuing solitude not as exile, but as clarity. The noise that once guided you begins to fade, replaced by an inner rhythm, slower but more honest. You realize that every step away from conformity is also a step toward something real. Some days you blend in again. You laugh when expected, nod at small talk, pretend to care about things that don't move you. It's not deceit, it's survival. But even then, part of you stands apart, watching it all like an observer who can't fully return to the play. You know too much now? You've seen how fragile identity becomes when it depends on others' approval. You can't unknow that truth, no matter how quietly you try to live it. And yet, despite the loneliness, there's a strange sense of gratitude. You've learned to be your own company, to find beauty in reflection rather than recognition. You stopped searching for applause and started listening for alignment. You understand now that rejection isn't the end of belonging. It's the beginning of belonging to yourself. The rebellion never really ends. It just softens. You stop fighting the world and start understanding it. You see that rejecting social norms isn't about superiority. It's about sincerity. It's the courage to face life without a mask, even when the air gets cold. You find quiet joy in simple things, an unfiltered conversation, a long walk without destination, a thought that feels entirely yours. There's a threshold you cross without noticing, a point where solitude stops feeling like punishment and starts feeling like peace. You no longer crave to be understood by everyone. You only crave to be honest with yourself. The noise of the crowd fades, replaced by a steady calm that doesn't need validation. You realize that true freedom isn't loud or dramatic. It's silent, subtle, almost invisible. And so you walk forward, not away from society, but through it. You still live among people, still smile, still share moments. But inside, you've changed. You're no longer performing. You're observing, learning, growing. The world hasn't become easier, but you've become gentler. The quiet rebellion has shaped you into someone who doesn't need to prove anything. You simply exist, truthfully, quietly, and free. Every human being, no matter how independent they claim to be, carries a quiet hunger to belong. It's not a weakness, but an inheritance, wired deep into the oldest parts of our brain. Long before cities and careers, belonging meant survival. The tribe's warmth protected you from the cold. Its approval meant safety, and exile meant slow disappearance. Though the world has changed, that ancient code still hums inside us. We seek the tribe, even when we tell ourselves we don't. We chase the subtle rewards of acceptance, the nods, the likes, the laughter that tells us we've done something right. But belonging today isn't always real. It's often curated, shaped by invisible machinery that rewards those who blend in. The modern world doesn't threaten you with exile in the wilderness. It offers a quieter punishment, invisibility. Step too far from what's expected, and people don't attack. They simply stop seeing you. That's the new form of rejection. You aren't cast out, you're ignored. Your words echo without response. Your presence fades from conversations, and your silence becomes a kind of erasure. It's a subtle, modern exile that leaves no scars, only questions. We tell ourselves we're free thinkers, but our freedom is often cosmetic. Every culture, every generation, builds its own script of what's admirable, desirable, and acceptable. These rules aren't written on paper. They're written in reactions. A raised eyebrow, a polite pause, a conversation that moves on too quickly. Over time, these small cues train us to adjust, to bend, to speak only the parts of truth that fit comfortably in others' ears. We learn the choreography of belonging without realizing we've joined a silent dance that everyone knows but no one admits exists. Approval is a quiet drug. It releases tiny doses of pleasure, convincing us that we're right, that we matter. Each time someone agrees, each time they smile or validate us, our minds record it as safety. But like any drug, it builds dependence. The moment the validation stops, we begin to crave it. Our opinions start to shift, not toward truth, but toward whatever will earn us that next emotional reward. It's not malice, it's biology. We want to be loved, and love is often confused with agreement. Even those who claim to reject society often carry its expectations in disguise. They build countercultures that mirror the very systems they escaped from. Different clothes, same hierarchy. Independence becomes another performance, another badge of identity to be approved by a smaller, different crowd. The illusion of freedom is comforting, but still, it's illusion. True freedom isn't the absence of rules. It's the ability to see them clearly and choose when to follow them without fear. Fear of exile is what keeps the machinery running. It doesn't matter how rational or self-aware you are. The thought of being truly unseen still stings. Humans are wired for mirrors. We discover ourselves through how others reflect us. Take away those reflections, and identity trembles. The mind begins to whisper doubts. Am I wrong? Am I strange? Am I nothing if no one understands me? This quiet panic pushes most people back toward conformity. They don't even call it that. They call it being realistic. Culture, at its core, is a collective hypnosis. It shapes what we value, what we desire, even what we fear. Most of us inherit beliefs before we have the tools to question them. We carry them like hand-me-down clothes that never quite fit, but we keep wearing them because everyone else does. These beliefs whisper through generations. Success means this, love looks like that, failure feels like shame. The voices of society don't need to be loud. They just need to be consistent. We're told what kind of success deserves applause, what kind of personality feels respectable, what kind of dreams are worth chasing. These definitions create invisible walls around our potential. Morality, too, becomes standardized, manufactured by collective agreement rather than individual reflection. When someone challenges it, they're labeled difficult, strange, or dangerous. But often, the people society calls rebels are simply those who stopped mistaking obedience for goodness. Even when we don't face open criticism, we feel the weight of invisible judgment. It lives in glances, in subtle changes of tone, in how people respond when we express something raw or unfamiliar. We start editing ourselves mid-sentence, softening the edges of our truth to keep the peace. Each small act of self-censorship seems harmless, but over time it builds a quiet cage. One day, you realize you're fluent in a language that no longer says what you mean. Individuality, when expressed sincerely, can threaten those who haven't faced their own suppressed truths. It exposes the cracks in collective comfort. That's why society often reacts defensively, not because your difference is wrong, but because it's honest. Your refusal to conform reminds others of their own quiet betrayals. They may not attack you directly. They might simply avoid you, dismiss you, or label you as too much. Yet behind those reactions often hides envy, the kind that comes from watching someone live freely in ways they never dared. Rebellion, when stripped of ego, isn't about rejection. It's about remembering. Remembering who you were before you were told who to be. When you stop seeking external validation, you begin to see how deeply it once controlled you. It's humbling, even painful. You realize how many choices were never truly yours, how many of your desires were borrowed. But that pain carries a strange relief. Awareness breaks the spell. Belonging doesn't vanish when you step outside the norm. It transforms. It becomes quieter, more selective. Instead of belonging everywhere, you start belonging deeply somewhere, even if that place is just within yourself. You begin to crave quality over quantity, truth over comfort. And though the world may not understand it, there's a profound peace in knowing that the acceptance you now seek isn't a reward from others. It's a reflection of your own alignment. By the time you reach this realization, you stop blaming society. You see that it's not some villain out there. It's a collection of frightened hearts, all trying to find safety. You recognize your own participation in the system. Every time you bit your tongue, every time you smiled to fit in. But rather than guilt, you feel compassion. Because once you've seen how fragile belonging really is, you understand why people cling to it so tightly. In the end, rejecting social norms doesn't mean rejecting people. It means refusing to live in fear of their approval. You still care, still connect, still participate, but now you do it consciously. You no longer move with the herd out of habit. You walk beside it by choice. You know that the true machinery of belonging isn't external. It lives inside your own mind. Once you master that, no silence, no rejection, no exile can take away your sense of home. When you choose to walk away from what everyone else calls normal, something inside you shifts. At first, it feels like liberation, like stepping into clean air after years of suffocation. But soon, a quieter reality begins to unfold. The world around you doesn't change with your awakening. People still follow the same rhythms, the same conversations, the same hierarchies of validation. You start to feel like a ghost walking among them, visible, yet unseen. You try to explain the changes inside you, but your words seem to lose meaning halfway through. They nod, they smile, but they don't really hear you. That's when the loneliness begins to take shape, not as absence, but as distance. The loneliness isn't loud. It doesn't scream or demand attention. It's subtle, almost elegant, the kind that hides between moments. It's in the silence after you share a thought that's too honest. It's in the glance that lingers when someone doesn't quite understand you. It's in the realization that you can no longer return to the comfort of pretending. You start missing the simplicity of belonging, even though you know it was never real. The heart doesn't crave truth as much as it craves warmth. And sometimes those two things don't live in the same place. Being misunderstood becomes a constant undercurrent. You try to express yourself clearly, but no matter how carefully you speak, people seem to hear something else. They interpret your sincerity as distance, your quiet as judgment, your independence as pride. After a while, you stop trying to correct them. You start conserving your energy for those rare moments when someone truly sees you. Those moments are rare, but when they happen, they feel like breathing after holding your breath for years. Still, the exhaustion lingers. Authenticity, as pure as it sounds, can be tiring. It costs energy to keep choosing truth in a world built on illusion. You feel a strange guilt for not being able to fit in, as though you owe the world a version of yourself that it prefers. That guilt sits quietly in your chest, whispering that maybe you're too sensitive, too complicated, too unwilling to just let things go. But you can't go back, not fully. Once you've glimpsed what's real, compromise feels like suffocation. Sometimes grief sneaks in, not for people you've lost, but for the version of yourself that used to belong somewhere. You grieve the ease of small talk, the comfort of shared delusion, the effortless connection of pretending. You realize that growth doesn't just add, it also subtracts. It takes away illusions, comfort, and the ability to be ignorant again. You trade simplicity for awareness, and that trade, while necessary, often feels heavier than you expected. There are days when your sense of self blurs. The more you detach from what you used to believe, the more uncertain your identity feels. You begin to question who you are without the label society gave you. If you're not your job, your status, your reputation, or your social role, then what's left? The answer doesn't come easily. It arrives slowly, through solitude, through long walks and quiet nights, through realizing that identity isn't something you wear, it's something you uncover. Amid this confusion, an inner voice begins to emerge. It's not loud, not dramatic, but steady. It's the voice that existed before the world told you who to be. It speaks softly, guiding you back to yourself. You start to trust it, even when it leads you into isolation. You learn to sit in silence without rushing to fill it. You begin to realize that the loneliness you feared is actually space. Space for new understanding, space for truth to breathe. But the emotional cost doesn't disappear overnight. There are mornings when you wake up heavy, drained by the constant effort of being misunderstood. It feels like an emotional hangover, fatigue from carrying the weight of awareness in a world that celebrates ignorance. You crave rest, but rest feels impossible when your mind refuses to stop observing everything. You see through facades you once found comforting, and it leaves you feeling both wise and weary. Eventually, solitude stops feeling like a wound and starts feeling like armor. You stop waiting for people to understand you and start learning to understand yourself. You no longer see isolation as emptiness, but as refinement. The quiet teaches you patience. It teaches you to find nourishment in small, honest moments instead of grand illusions. You start appreciating the beauty of being unseen, It frees you from performance. There's a purity in existing without an audience. And slowly, something beautiful begins to happen. The pain that once felt unbearable begins to transform. The misunderstandings, the loneliness, the exhaustion, all of it becomes material for growth. You realize that every rejection stripped away a false layer. Every silence invited deeper reflection. Every ache carved space for empathy. The very pain that once made you question your path now fuels your wisdom. You begin to see meaning where before there was only suffering. By the time you reach this point, you no longer seek to be understood by everyone. You stop chasing approval like oxygen. You understand that some connections are meant to end so you can make space for truth. The emotional aftermath becomes your teacher, a slow, demanding, but compassionate one. You see how pain refines you, how solitude polishes your inner clarity, how misunderstanding deepens your capacity for compassion. The journey doesn't end with peace, it ends with perspective. You begin to see that the emotional turbulence wasn't punishment, it was purification. The loneliness was clearing space. The silence was healing noise. The exhaustion was stripping away everything false. You stand lighter now, quieter, but stronger. You've learned to breathe in uncertainty, to find comfort in your own presence, to walk alone without feeling lost. In the stillness that follows, you realize something profound. The world didn't reject you. It simply reflected the parts of itself you no longer matched. The cost of rejecting social norms was never about losing others. It was about finding yourself beneath everything you were told to be. And though that discovery came wrapped in pain, it left behind something unshakable. Peace, not as the absence of struggle, but as the acceptance of truth. Solitude is not a punishment, though it often begins as one. When the noise of the crowd fades and you are left with only your thoughts, it feels like being dropped into an empty room with no doors. But slowly, as the silence deepens, something begins to awaken inside you. The same solitude that once felt unbearable starts revealing its hidden warmth. It becomes a forge, a quiet space where your fragmented self begins to melt and take new shape. You start to notice small details again. The stillness of morning air, the rhythm of your breath, the faint hum of your own existence. These moments, once overlooked, become sacred. You realize that the absence of distraction is not emptiness, but possibility. In that stillness, you begin to see how much of your identity had been borrowed. The clothes, the opinions, even your ambitions, they were stitched together from the world's expectations. Without them, you feel stripped, vulnerable, uncertain. But in that nakedness, something honest appears. You start to feel what's truly yours, your quiet preferences, your private joys, your real pace. Detachment, once mistaken for loneliness, starts feeling like clarity. You no longer chase every echo of approval. You begin to listen to the faint, steady pulse of your own truth. It's strange how peace creeps in, not suddenly, but like dawn through a window. You find beauty in simplicity, the slow pour of coffee, the sound of rain, the texture of thought. You start observing more and reacting less. The world no longer feels like a battlefield demanding your participation. You become a quiet thinker, someone who moves through life not to impress, but to understand. People may misread your calm as indifference, but inside, there's a richness they can't see, a mind learning to stand still in a spinning world. Through solitude, you begin to sense the strength of sensitivity. What once felt like a curse, your tendency to feel too deeply, to think too much, now becomes your greatest tool. You realize that sensitivity isn't weakness, it's depth. It allows you to perceive subtleties others miss. The hesitation in someone's smile, the tension in polite laughter, the unspoken truths hiding in silence. You start valuing honesty over comfort, depth over popularity. The world still moves fast, but you no longer feel the need to keep up. You found value in slowness. Growth, you learn, doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes it looks like stillness, like waiting, like doing nothing visible. The power of slow growth is that it roots you deeply. The world worships speed, but speed often creates shallow roots. You begin to grow differently, quietly, patiently beneath the surface. You realize that real progress can't always be measured. It must be felt. The slow shaping of character, the subtle strengthening of self-trust. These are invisible victories that no one claps for, but they change everything. Pain becomes your mirror. The moments you wanted to escape become reflections that teach you who you are. Every wound reveals a hidden layer of strength. Every disappointment sharpens your discernment. You begin to see that suffering isn't always cruelty, it's correction. Life uses pain to sand away illusions, to polish you into something more authentic. You no longer resent hardship. You start to see it as sacred instruction. What once felt like breaking now feels like unfolding. And in this unfolding, you discover a strange influence you didn't know you had. Without trying, your quietness begins to affect others. People sense calm around you, even if they can't explain it. They start to open up, drawn by the peace you carry. You realize that influence doesn't require a stage or an audience. It grows naturally from authenticity. By simply being yourself without noise, you give others silent permission to do the same. You become what you once searched for, a presence that feels real in a world of performance. Understanding starts to replace resentment. You no longer see others as asleep or shallow. You see them as versions of yourself at earlier stages. You understand why people cling to the familiar, why they fear change, why they protect illusions. Compassion takes the place of judgment. You stop arguing to be understood because you finally understand. Serenity comes not from winning against society, but from no longer needing to. You've stepped outside the invisible competition. The reward is quiet, but it's pure. Eventually, solitude no longer feels like isolation. It feels like belonging, not to a group, but to life itself. You start finding connection in unexpected places, in nature, in art, in fleeting conversations that carry truth. You realize you don't need to fit into every circle. You only need to find a few who speak the same emotional language. And even when you're alone, you don't feel abandoned, you feel aligned. The world becomes less like something to conquer and more like something to participate in. By the end, you understand that exile was never punishment. It was initiation. Being cast out of what was false allowed you to enter what was real. You no longer chase acceptance because you've learned to accept yourself fully. You stop demanding that life be easy and start appreciating that it's honest. The gift within the exile is freedom, not freedom from others, but freedom from the need to please them. You realize that belonging doesn't mean being the same. It means being seen, even if only by yourself. And in that seeing, you find peace that no crowd could ever give you. There comes a point in every quiet person's journey where silence stops being a refuge and starts becoming a responsibility. You realize that staying calm while the world screams is not a sign of weakness. It's endurance disguised as stillness. You've learned to absorb noise without reacting, to face misunderstanding without explaining yourself, to carry pain without making it visible. That strength is invisible to most, but it lives in every moment you choose peace over chaos. You carry storms within you, yet no one sees the lightning. People often mistake your restraint for indifference, not knowing how much effort it takes to stay grounded when your heart trembles with unspoken storms. You begin to understand that strength isn't about how loud you can be, but how deeply you can remain anchored when life tries to pull you apart. There's a certain nobility in not needing to prove your worth. You stop arguing for validation because your energy is too sacred to waste on misunderstanding. Instead, you channel that energy inward into self-mastery, reflection, and the quiet rebuilding of your inner foundation. You become your own healer, your own teacher, your own mirror. In silence, you learn the art of endurance, and endurance becomes your quiet rebellion against a world that worships noise. The deeper you grow, the fewer people can meet you there. You start realizing that depth can feel like distance. You crave meaningful conversation, but find yourself surrounded by surface-level talk. You listen more than you speak, not because you have nothing to say, but because your words deserve an atmosphere of understanding. When it doesn't exist, you stay silent. This silence becomes your language, a form of communication that only the emotionally awake can hear. You stop rushing to fill spaces because you've learned that not everything broken needs noise to be healed. Sometimes stillness is enough. Your solitude begins to transform into something golden. It's no longer an escape. It's a form of clarity. You start seeing patterns others miss. The repetition of hurt, the cycle of pretense, the disguises of ego. You observe without judgment, as if life were a classroom and every experience a teacher. Pain becomes data. Disappointment becomes refinement. You learn to separate temporary emotions from eternal truths. That perspective grants you peace that cannot be faked. You no longer depend on outcomes for happiness, because you've learned to find beauty in the process itself. There are days when the weight of understanding feels unbearable. You wish you could unsee, unknow, unfeel. You wish you could return to simpler ignorance. But awareness, once gained, cannot be undone. So you carry it, sometimes gracefully, sometimes wearily, but always consciously. The awareness that made you different also made you resilient. It gave you eyes that see beneath appearances and a heart that loves despite betrayal. You start understanding that maturity is not about control, it's about acceptance. You learn to let go of explanations and trust that time will reveal what words cannot. You also begin to realize that not everyone is meant to walk beside you. Some people belong only to earlier chapters of your story. Their leaving is not loss, it's evolution. The space they leave behind becomes the soil for your next growth. You stop chasing after those who can't meet your silence with peace. You start cherishing the few who can sit with you without forcing conversation, those who understand that connection isn't always loud. The rare ones who make your silence feel full are the ones who belong in your future. You start forgiving, not because people deserve it, but because peace deserves space. You stop carrying bitterness like armor and learn to release it like a burden. Forgiveness doesn't mean forgetting. It means choosing freedom over replaying pain. You understand that resentment ties you to the past, while acceptance frees you to move forward. Each act of forgiveness becomes a quiet revolution within your soul, a reclaiming of energy that was once trapped in anger. You realize you don't need closure from others. You can give it to yourself. And so your quiet strength grows, not from grand victories, but from silent choices. You choose patience when rushed, kindness when hurt, detachment when provoked. Every small decision builds the architecture of your inner peace. You learn that discipline is not suppression, but direction. You channel emotion into art, reflection, and purpose. Your silence becomes productive. Your calm becomes creative. What others see as withdrawal is really transformation. You are no longer escaping the world. You are reshaping your place within it. The beauty of silent strength is that it doesn't demand recognition. It's invisible power. While others seek applause, you seek alignment. You stop performing for approval because you've learned that authenticity is quieter than attention. You move through life like a steady current, unseen but undeniable. Those who notice your calm may never fully understand it, but they feel it. You've become a quiet influence, a mirror reminding others of their own unspoken depth. Without preaching, you teach. Without trying, you heal. In the end, you realize that your silence was never emptiness. It was preservation. It protected what was sacred until you were strong enough to share it. The world may never know how many battles you fought quietly, how many times you broke and rebuilt yourself in the dark. But you know, and that knowledge is enough. You don't need to be loud to be powerful. You only need to be whole. Silent strength is not about holding everything in. It's about holding everything with grace. And that grace, once awakened, becomes unshakable. It's the kind of strength that no storm can steal, the kind of peace that doesn't need to be seen to be real.